wonderful introductory presentation, and thank you to the organisers for accommodating me at this time. It's really hard for everyone on our panel to be in the same time zone, and I realise that other people are going to have more of a challenge than I am. So I want to start by saying that I'm not really a sociolinguist. I'm a linguistic anthropologist, but I think we're all essentially doing the same sort of work, but centering it in slightly different ways. Sorry, I should be on there. So if you ask a random person to give an example of a constructed language, they'll probably bring up Esperanto, created as a utopian auxiliary language to unite the world, or Klingon, spoken by the Klingon alien species in the Star Trek series. These, I think, are two perfectly good examples of constructed languages, and I think they are sufficient reference points to ground my very basic definition of conlanging, which to me is the practice of intentional and systematic language construction. I just, while David was talking, threw in a screenshot of Christine Schreier's definition from her paper as well. But I'm really just talking about it as a practice here. So this definition doesn't demand any motivation for construction, nor does it want to isolate any potential consequences of construction. And that's deliberate because I want the definition to help bring to light a wider range of activities and ideologies under the banner of this practice. I'm not going to be making any big or incisive argument in this presentation except to try to inject an anthropological perspective and to illustrate the importance of relativizing the phenomenon of language construction. I'm going to do this by introducing a number of conlangs used in small-scale or indigenous societies, and in particular the Eskayan language of the Philippines. One of the problems I see in the literature is that indigenous constructed languages tend to be represented in terms of, say, ritual language or disguised speech, or as peculiar registers with arcane functions, which is all fine, but this means that the element of agency and creativity in language construction is de-emphasized, and that's consistent, I think, with the structuralist era habit of representing Indigenous people as merely responding to environmental pressures or of existing within static social arrangements. And rather, I think we need to assume that, like everyone else, they are drivers of their own history who make conscious political and aesthetic choices, and those choices can be expressed linguistically. And I want to make the general point that language construction practices allow us to see language ideologies that might otherwise be harder to detect. And language ideologies are, according to Shirley Heath, the self-evident ideas and objectives a group holds concerning roles of language in the social experiences of members as they contribute to the expression of the group. The self-evident in this case is indicating self-evident to the group. In other words, they are taken for granted by the speakers, not necessarily by outsiders to that group. The kind of common sense understanding. So this, to me, is quite foundational to linguistic anthropology as a discipline, this focus on ideologies. What I'm going to show, I hope, is that there are interesting continuities as well as discontinuities between the ideologies that underpin Western and non-Western conlangs. There are hundreds of conlangs that exist or have existed in the world, and there are various online resources for finding them. But I think the best is still the appendix of Erica Okrent's superb book, In the Land of Invented Languages, where she lists 500 conlangs. And this is a nice round number, which has allowed her to effectively curate and filter the list. And it's also conveniently published online. The URL is there down the bottom. So she included conlangs for which there is good historical evidence, and she made an effort to be as representative as possible by, for example, making sure that conlangs from diverse regions of the world are included. And yet what we see from this list is that almost all recorded conlangs are from Europe or later in time from North America. Of the 500 total examples, there are only 8 from outside this zone, 3 from India, 2 from Iran, 1 from Ghana, 1 from Nigeria, and 1 from Vietnam. And this is something that she acknowledges, of course. The sample also helps us see that conlanging is historically situated. So she's listed conlangs from as far back as the 12th century, and yet the vast majority were created in the 20th century, 72% of them in fact. And the named creators of the listed conlangs are all male, with only 2 exceptions that I can find. What's revealing for me is that many of the conlangs are utopian projects, and their motivation is either to promote rational thinking with the Worldvian assumption that language distorts clarity, and or as an auxiliary tool to expand communication across languages, sometimes premised on an assumption that linguistic diversity is a barrier that aggravates conflict between groups. These seem to be the two dominating language ideologies among conlangers, or the self-evident ideas concerning the roles of language. From about the middle of the 20th century onwards, we get what are sometimes called artlangs, or languages that have been created as aesthetic products to help build fictional worlds, so Tolkien's languages, Klingon, etc., and others still might be created simply as intellectual exercises with no explicit ideology or aesthetic aim behind them. So the profile that emerges, to reduce this as crudely as possible, is that conlangers are, on the whole, speakers of European languages. They are literate, having been educated in formal institutional settings. They are male, they are 20th century, and they create conlangs as intellectual, political, or artistic experiments. And they seem to harbour the view that natural languages are cognitively or politically limiting. In most cases, there are no actual speakers of the conlang, except perhaps the single named creator. And there are counterexamples, but this, I think, is the trend. So thus, despite the fact that many auxiliary conlangs are reaching for universality, think Esperanto, Ockren's list shows conlanging itself is a curiously provincial activity, flourishing in a particular historical moment within elite groups belonging to a limited number of large-scale agricultural economies. And as an anthropologist, I find this rare tribe of conlangers to be quite exotic and very much worthy of scholarly attention. But what I want to do is to step back from this historical and ethnographic snapshot and look a little bit more comparatively at the practice of systematic and intentional language construction beyond the West. And here I just want to refer back to David's point about this kind of spectrum and Christine's point as well. So I came to be interested in this question because of fieldwork I did within the Eskayan community of the Philippines. That had in fact invented not only an entire language, but also a writing system, a literary canon, and a whole cultural program. And what's interesting is that this was an isolated community of subsistence farmers that had only had access to formal education and literacy in a very limited way before they innovated the language and script. I worked with this group on and off for some years, starting in 2006. And I started out as a foreign aid worker with the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples of the Philippines, where my task was to evaluate the Eskayan language and its writing system. And I then went on to do a PhD and then a book. But I'll come back to the Eskayan so that I can briefly show you a few other neat examples of systematic language construction in non-Western traditions across the globe. I'm going to start by talking briefly about West Africa and Australia, and then I'll discuss island Southeast Asia and bring the Eskayan people and their language into focus. And I've chosen these parts of the world to contrast with Europe and America only because that's where I have research interests. I'm sure others listening will be able to fill out this picture with more examples of intentional and systematic language construction elsewhere. So in West Africa, we have the Gwoza language constructed in Nigeria in 1965, and El Afrihili developed in Ghana in 1970. So both creators were educated within the British colonial system. Alex Igbeneweka, who invented Gwoza, explicitly stated that he wanted an indigenous lingua franca for West Africa to supplant the lingua francas of the existing lingua francas of English, Spanish and French, which he identified as imposters. The Ghanaian historian who was inspired to create El Afrihili aimed for a Pan-African auxiliary to promote political unity and trade. So these two conlangs could be described as post-colonial auxiliaries. That's the same kind of utopian drive that gave impetus to Esperanto, but in this instance, the aspiration is for decolonization and a linguistic reimagining of West Africa, or even Africa, as a political unity. Now, there's a couple of lesser-known conlangs in the same region. These include Shumom, created in Cameroon in about 1911, and metaphyedron from Nigeria in the 1930s. Neither of these are listed by Ockrent. These are a bit different because their creators are not formally educated within a colonial system, and in fact the creator of Shumon, there on the left, was not literate at all. So Shumon was a secret courtly language revealed to the Sultan Ibrahim Njoya with assistance from a multilingual Belgian teacher, and the pair generated a lexicon from French, German and English words with reassigned glosses in Njoya's language of Bamul. So this is a process called relexification. It was designed apparently so that Njoya could communicate with his close advisors and for their conversations to remain private. But today it's no longer restricted. It's quite popular in parts of Cameroon, and there are even radio programs in the language. Shumon also had its own script, used both for the constructed Shumon language and the natural Bamul language. There's an example of the script in the middle. Metaphyedron, meanwhile, on the right, was created by an Ibibio-speaking religious leader of Nigeria. It also had its own script. It's basically a relexification of English, with, in my view, a preponderance of lexical borrowings from Portuguese. And so again, this relexification, substituting one lexeme for another while preserving syntax to a certain extent. It was used largely for liturgy, prayer, the singing of hymns, and written communications between members of the congregation. What's also interesting is that neither inventor claimed direct authorship of their languages. They received them instead through a process of revelation or of dreaming. At least this is the story. This is the origin story. So now I'm going to switch over to Australia and bring up the textbook example of an Australian Indigenous conlang, and that's the Daman initiation language of Mornington Island. Speakers attributed its creation either to known elders or to a Dreamtime ancestor, and it's no longer used, but it was taught through explicit instruction to young men who are going through the Warama initiation ceremonies. Daman is superficially a relexification of the natural Ladal language, but it involves the innovation of hypernyms on a one-to-many model. And I'll show you some of those there. You can see how the Daman, the conlang on the left, is creating a new lexeme that encompasses a bunch of these, an entire category. There is also some reduction of morphological complexity. There are only two pronouns, me and not me, and a revised phoneme inventory that includes click sounds, which otherwise don't exist at all in Australian languages. This is by no means an Australian outlier, and I think we have to see it in the context of other Australian initiation languages, but also in the widespread use of what are called mother-in-law languages, which are for showing respect between dyads of an avoidance relationship. So within earshot of his mother-in-law, a son-in-law in many parts of Australia must use a register of near total lexical replacement of content words. This is rarely a one-to-one lexical replacement either. So like Daman, it ends up being a remapping of the lexicon as a one-to-many relationship, or many-to-one, depending on which direction you're looking. Even more widespread in Australia is the practice of lexical innovation as part of mortuary taboo. So this is pretty much everywhere on the continent, and even recorded in Tasmania. When a person passes away, their name can no longer be spoken for a period of time or forever. In some traditions, anything rhyming with that name or which is evocative of that name needs to be replaced with an innovated term, and this kind of intentional planning is often cited as one of the drivers of language change more broadly in Australia. So moving north of Australia, there are a number of constructed languages in Indonesia and Papua New Guinea that I discuss in my book. These are mostly used for fortifying distinctions between categories of entities, the human world and the spirit world, or the human world and elements of the animal world. And in practice, just like in Australia, they mark out a sphere of action and interaction with associated norms of group identity or behaviour. So finally, up in the Philippines, so there's another many-to-one in a mother-in-law relationship, very similar to what we've seen here, the shellfish and the grass. Okay, so where are we up to? The Eskayan language is interesting because it appears to be driven by a lot of the ideologies that we've already talked about, including those that are associated with Western conlangs. So utopianism, Worldvianism, and even the aesthetics of artlangs. But we can also compare it to the West African and Australian examples. So Eskayan is a very successful conlang. It's spoken here in Bohol. So that's where Bohol is, that little blue spot. And more specifically in 5 villages along this ridge line here. It's been around since the 1920s and is still going strong. It only came to the attention of the wider public in 1980 when touring agricultural advisors were moving through the interior of the island, and they came across, this is what the interior looks like, and they came across what they characterised as a lost tribe inhabiting a large clearing at the top of a mountain and speaking an unrecognised language. So this got into the local press, where there was a lot of discussion of where Eskayan people came from. Some argued that they were a remnant indigenous population that had survived waves of colonial intrusion. Others said that they were a displaced population, and others still made the claim that they had invented their language simply in order to attract government funding as a cultural minority. So what's interesting is that those early journalists didn't think to ask Eskayan people themselves about their own origins and traditions, nor to look closely at the language. So, and it turns out that the Eskayan language can tell you a great deal about its origins, and Eskayan people have stories about their own origins and traditions, some of which they've even recorded in writing as part of their manuscript tradition. From my analysis, the language is a relexification of Visayan, which is the language that dominates in the southern Philippines, including in Bohol. It's grammatically almost identical to Visayan, but with a very systematic reduction in morphology. There is a many-to-one relationship in the verbal affixing. So the 24 Visayan verbal affixes and their allomorphs are handled by just 5 Eskayan counterparts. I'm afraid this diagram is really, really hard to make sense of. But trust me, if you look, the bold is Eskayan and the italics is Visayan, and you can see how the Eskayan morphemes there, the affixes repeat. They just need 5. Just like Damen, there is at least one introduced exotic phoneme sound that isn't available contrastively in Visayan. So there's the sound j, which is very rare in Philippine languages at all. The syllable structure is very similar to Spanish, meaning that Eskayan words sound like Spanish words. So you get words like ingrato, almorada, birurario. They're not Spanish words, they just sound like Spanish words. But most of the vocabulary is impossible to trace, and in those rare cases when you can trace a clear lexical influence, most of the borrowings end up being from Spanish, and the remainder come from Visayan dialects and even from English. And there's evidence of relexification from all of these languages when you look at the semantic space that Eskayan lexemes occupy. So it looked like the language had been purposefully planned from scratch using other languages for inspiration, including colonial languages. The picture that emerged for me was that the Eskayan really were a displaced community. They could trace their ancestry to a fishing village on the west coast of the island that was destroyed by US forces in 1901 during the Philippine-American War. About 60 refugee families regrouped in the Southeast Highlands, started a new settlement, and this is when they came under the sway of a multilingual anti-colonial prophet. Later on in the 1920s, this prophet claimed to have rediscovered the lost language of the island carved onto tablets. And he used these texts to teach the language again. According to these tablets, the language was created by an ancestor who was instructed by the Holy Child to fashion it from a human body. There's the ancestor there. In practice, though, the recovery of the language and script was a collaborative act that involved quite a number of people between the 1920s and 1930s. At least this is from my analysis. It's evidence that, it was a group effort. Eskayan is regarded by its speakers as the true indigenous language of the island. All the other languages are characterised as sort of imposter colonial languages brought from outside, including Visayan. Learning it and speaking it and writing it are therefore acts of anti-colonial patriotism. There are Eskayan stories in which the language is invested with a kind of divine incantatory power that overwhelms colonial languages. Today, the primary domains of use are for singing, praying, including restricted women's prayer, speech-making, hand-copying traditional texts, and for schooling. It's not used as a language of day-to-day speech, and no children are raised in the language. They begin to learn it from about age 7 or 8. What they're speaking is day-to-day is Visayan, or the Boholana Visayan dialect of Visayan. There is a world-building dimension to Eskayan, since arguably the primary domain of its use is in the reproduction of traditional written stories. There are thousands and thousands of pages of stories, many of which are written in Visayan but using the script. But when an Eskayan person is speaking in a dialogue, the language is Eskayan, and this illustrates something about their status as characters in these stories. So there's even a kind of Worf-infused story where Eskayan speakers are watching Magellan's crew climb back on board on a boat, and they describe this in Eskayan words that the men are ascending a bamboo ladder to enter into a house draped in 11 cloths. So it's as if they don't have the words to express the sight of a large sailing vessel. For Eskayan speakers, language is associated with nationhood and territory, very much in a similar way that we see especially in Herderian European language ideologies. But this idea of language equals land and territorial sovereignty is also found in Indigenous Australia. It's not a kind of a Western-only ideology. It's not necessarily an imported ideology. So Eskayan is demarcating a territorial zone and reinforcing insider-outsider social relationships, like we've already seen with some other Indigenous conlangs. But at the same time, in a contrary direction, it embodies a kind of Esperanto-ish utopianism. Anyone is free to learn it and speak it and write it, and there is in fact a prophecy that one day it will be the only language spoken in the world, hence the title of my book, The Last Language on Earth. I've just noticed that the OUP stand I've seen in a tweet has my book on it. If you want to flick through it, you can see some pretty pictures. Okay, and this is a positive expression. This kind of prophecy is a positive expression of world unity in which the island of Bohol is politically centred. So what I've tried to do in this talk is to look more expansively at the concept of language construction as a global phenomenon as opposed to a niche intellectual activity within large-scale industrialized societies. I've shown, I hope, that non-Western conlangs can be created and used for the purposes of indexing and reproducing special kinds of social arrangements or relationships. So insider-outsider political distinctions are important, as we've seen. Courtly elites versus non-elites, colonizer versus indigenous people, initiates and non-initiates, but also for establishing the correct kinds of relationships between kin or between categories of entities like humans and spirits or humans and God. In other words, these indigenous conlangs are doing a lot of the boundary work in regulating specialised channels of communication. Related to this, constructed languages also have a world-building potential, and they can be projected recursively as representations of desired social arrangements that may not be fully actualized. So this is the case with Eskayan as the last language on Earth, but also with the post-colonial or anti-colonial auxiliary languages of West Africa, and I would also argue with Australian initiation languages. These functions are somewhat similar but also distinct from utopian European conlangs or artlangs, because in Europe I think we sometimes see a similar tension between the need to index the identity of a community of speakers while transcending communication across social boundaries. So transcending the social boundaries. So a few key differences that I want to point out that may scale up into wider patterns. The examples I've shown of Indigenous conlangs are all to a large extent relexifications of natural languages, but it's never as simple as plugging in one word for another word. We see relexifications from more than one linguistic template simultaneously, and we often see these many-to-one lexical relationships that may also be expressed morphosyntactically. In other words, the conlangs are reduced, and that's by design. Another difference is that the authorship of Indigenous conlangs is very often negated entirely or attributed to distant ancestors or processes of revelation. In Eskayan, it's all of the above. It's regarded by its speakers as a natural language while also being attributed to the creative agency of an ancestor. Okay, so I hope I've shown that the intentional and systematic construction of language is widespread, it's diverse, and it's worth analysing this practice in a comparative frame so that we can see and appreciate the kinds of social and sociolinguistic work that is being enacted in each case. So that's it. Thank you very much.